Hilchos Pesulei Hamukdashin Perek Rabbi, the laws of disqualified, consecrated entities, chapter 4. Today we're going to be studying a very unique topic in sacrificial law, which is called the Chatois HaMesos, the sin offerings that have to be put to death. Essentially, there are 4 cases, which we're going to discuss in detail, that if they happen to a sin offering, those offerings have to be left to die. A parallel concept that's going to be discussed is that in other cases where the sin offerings become disqualified, they don't have to be left to die, but instead they have to be left to graze. Roya, or tira be'eder, we're going to have these terms again and again in today's chapter. It basically means that it's not qualified enough to be brought on the altar, but it's not completely unsanctified, and so you have to leave the animal to graze, just in the fields with other sheep, until it gets a blemish and can no longer be offered anyways, at which point you convert it to money, and then the value is used towards either another sin offering or a voluntary offering, as the Rambam will describe. In continuation to that, the chapter is going to explore cases of asham, of a guilt offering, that also have that same law of tira or re'iyah, of grazing in the field till it develops a blemish and dies. That's pretty much where we're heading today. The Chatois HaMesos, first the sin offerings that are left to die, then the Chatases that are left to graze, and then the Ashams that are left to graze. And there's going to be a lot of specific cases within these categories, but that's basically the concept. So the Rambam begins with the Chatois HaMesos. Vlad Chatas. First of all, if a sin offering has a baby. Utmuras Chatas. If there is an exchange done to a sin offering. We're going to have an entire set of laws called the laws of Tmura at the end of the next book. It basically says that when a person dedicates a specific animal to being a sacrifice, you cannot exchange that animal, even if you think it's better. You cannot move the sanctity from this animal to another one. But if you did, the Torah has a fine, a penalty, which says, V'hayahu utmurasa yiyeh kaidesh. Both it and the exchange are both holy. So while you cannot do the exchange is effective if you did do it, and both animals become holy. So Tmuras Chatas is a situation where the exchange was done to a sin offering. You had an animal that was supposed to be brought as a sin offering, and you say, you know what, I don't want to bring this one, I want to bring the other one. Now they both become holy. The original one retains its status of Chatas, and the second one is called Tmuras Chatas. Number 3, V'chatas shemesu be'aleha, a sin offering whose owners died. The whole point of a sin offering is to atone for the owner's sin. If the owner died, now there's no reason to bring the sin offering. And number 4, v'chatas she'avda v'nimtzeis achar shekipru abaylim. A animal that was set aside as a sin offering, it got lost, and we'll see that lost is specific, not stolen, specifically lost, and it was only discovered after the owner already used another animal for atonement. So you put aside this sheep, it got lost, you go, hey, I got to bring my sin offering, I'll use another sheep. After you finish offering the second sheep, you find the first one. In all of these 4 scenarios, hare'elu yamusu. These animals have to be left to die. The baby, the exchange, the animal whose owner died, and the animal that was discovered after being lost, they have to die. Now for a moment, the Rambam goes a little deeper into the 4th case. Nimtzeis, if the first animal was discovered, was found, achar shenishchato hachatas hashniya, shehifrish, kaidem sheyizarek dama, after the slaughtering of the second chatas that was put aside, but before the sprinkling of the blood. And as we've seen numerous times, the sprinkling of the blood is an integral part of the sacrificial service. Actually, that's where the atonement is achieved for the carbon chatas. So again, you put aside a sheep, you lost it. You take a second sheep, you slaughter it in the Beis Hamikdash, and just before you have a chance to sprinkle the blood, you discover the first one. Harezu safek im tamus im tirat sheyipel bamum. This one goes into a doubt. Is it in the category of a chatas that has to be left to die? Or perhaps it's in the second category that I mentioned in the introduction, the category of the chatas that has to be left to graze with the other sheep till it gets a blemish. Lefichach tamus, therefore in this case, it also should be left to die. Out of doubt, we're going to be stringent. V'keitzad hein mesos, how exactly do we go about having these sin offerings or animals related to sin offerings die? Leisha yargen b'kli ay b'yadeh. It doesn't mean you kill them with a utensil or with your hand. You simply put them into a home or into a room, into a stall, and you lock it until they die. It's a pretty tragic concept, but as the Rambam immediately says, Udvarim elu kulam mipim Moshe Rabbeinu nishmu. These words were heard directly from Moshe Rabbeinu. This is a special halacha l'Moshe Misina that in the case of a sin offering, in these 4 cases specifically, they have to be left to die. But there's a big caveat. Ein kol advarim amurim ela b'chatas yachid bilvad. This law of the chatois hamesos only applies to an individual's sin offering, a personal sin offering, which a person has to bring for doing a sin. Aval chatas tzibur. But if there were to be a communal sin offering, so in a moment the Rambam will discuss how communal will relate to the first 3 cases, but first the 4th case. If the 4th case happens to a communal sin offering, which means she'avda, it got lost, v'nimtzes achar kapara, and then it was discovered after the community already used another animal to achieve atonement on their behalf, bein ru'uya, bein eino ru'uya, whether or not it's fitting in its current state to be brought as a sacrifice, tire ad sheyipel b'mum, v'timacher v'yiplu dameh lindava. You follow not the rule of the dying chatas, but rather the rule of re'iyah, of grazing. Have the discovered chatas graze till it develops a blemish, then it'll be sold and the money will go to voluntary offerings. Now, that's only in the 4th case. What about the first 3? Says the Rambam, they're not applicable to communal offerings. When it comes to a communal sin offering, you cannot apply the term baby, exchange, or owners dying. Because first of all communal sacrifices are male, so there could be no animal having a baby. Number 2, the community is not powerful enough to effectuate Tumura exchange. If the community does it, the exchange does not go into effect. So there will be no animal that's a Tumuras Chatas Tzibur. Ve'ein kol Yisrael Mesam, and the owners can't die because even halacha dictates that all the Jewish people can never die. The entire Jewish nation will never cease to exist. And so there will never be a scenario where the Chatas Tzibur doesn't have an owner, because somebody from the Jewish people will always be alive. The only case that could be is the 4th case. And even there the Rambam says we don't treat it with death like an individual, we treat it with re'iyah, with grazing. Halacha Beis, the Rambam considers a specific example of a communal sin offering, where this concept happens to it. Par v'sor shel Yom Kippurim, the special bull offered by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, the special goat offered as a sin offering on Yom Kippur. There was 2 goats. One of them was pushed off a cliff, the other one was brought as a chatas. These are both communal sin offerings. She'avdu, they got lost. V'hifrish achedim tachteyan, and the community set aside another bull, another goat, and actually sacrificed them, as the commentaries explain. V'chein, or similarly, se'irei avodah zarah, the idol worship goats. These are also communal sin offerings. If the court issues an erroneous ruling about idol worship, and most of the people follow them, every tribe had to bring a goat as a sin offering. So they were planning to bring this goat, she'avdu, the goat got lost, v'hifrish achedim tachteyan, and the community set aside another goat in their place and sacrificed them. And then, after the sacrificing, the original ones were found. What do you do with the original ones? So, as we just said, it's just a specific scenario of it. Yiru ad sheyipel behen mum, they should be left to graze until they develop a blemish. V'yimachru v'yiplu d'mei lindava, and they'll be sold, and their money will be used to voluntary burnt offerings. She'ein chatas hatzibur mesa, because we'll never leave a communal sin offering to death. This is a direct application of the previous law. Now there's one point that has to be addressed, which is v'lama lo yikrivu atzman lindava. Why don't we bring the bull and the goat themselves that were found as the voluntary burnt offering? Shari zacharim heim, because they're males. What is the Rambam asking? In a case of an individual sin offering, every individual sin offering is a female. So in the case where it gets lost, you bring another one and you find the original one, there's no way to bring the original one as a burnt offering, because burnt offering has to be a male. So you have to let it graze till it gets a blemish, sell it, and buy a male animal which you can bring as a burnt offering. But in the cases of the communal sin offering, the communal sin offerings themselves are male. There's a bull and a male goat. So yes, they got lost and you bought another one. So now that you found the original ones, just bring them as a voluntary burnt offering, because they're males and they could be brought as a burnt offering. So the Rambam answers, Gzeira la'achar kapardo mishum lifnei kapardo. We decreed in this scenario, after the community had already used the second one for atonement, so that there should not be confusion in a case where it's discovered before the atonement. Meaning, if this exact case had happened, the bull or the goat had gotten lost, they put aside a second one, and they found the first ones before using the second ones, so of course in that case they would have to be left to graze and get a blemish. So therefore, even after you use the second ones, and there's nothing else to be done with the first ones except to bring them as a burnt offering, we're still going to make them graze, not to get confused, and not bring them themselves as an offering, graze, get a blemish, sell them, and then bring voluntary burnt offerings. Returning now to the individual sin offering. Hamafrish chatasai ve'avda. A person puts aside a sin offering and it gets lost. Ve'hifrish acheres tachtea. He puts aside a second one. Ve'nimtzes harishayna v'harishtem aimdes. And he finds the first one and they're both here. In the first halacha, we discussed two scenarios. Either you find the first one after already fully sacrificing the second one, or at least you find the first one after slaughtering the second one before sprinkling its blood. But what if you found the first one before anything? You now have two live animals here, both of which you set aside for a sin offering. What do you do? It says that Rambam, Mashach achas mishtein v'niskaper ba. If you didn't ask any questions, you simply pulled aside one of them and used it for your atonement. So since you completely ignored the other one, ha'acheres tamus, the other one has to be left to die. Essentially, we're going to consider it like the fourth case, an animal that was discovered after the atonement. But if you come to ask a question, which means you care about the fate of both animals, we will instruct him that he should use for atonement the one he put aside first. And the second one, since it wasn't completely ignored, is not going to be left to die. It'll be left to graze till it develops a blemish. The and it will be sold and its money will go to voluntary burnt offerings. If at this point when he found the other animal, and now he has both in front of him, one of them was unblemished and one of them had a blemish, so obviously the unblemished one has to be offered, but the one with the blemish still has some sanctity, it has to be redeemed. And then the money, the animal will go out to chulin and the money will be used for sacrifices proceeds. Nevertheless, fascinating law, even after you redeem the animal with a mum, and technically once we redeem an animal, it's supposed to be completely chulin, completely mundane, when it comes to a chatas, there's still some sanctity that it holds on to until you actually will bring the unblemished one. And therefore, if you slaughtered the animal with the blemish before completing the sacrificial procedure of the unblemished one, before sprinkling its blood, harezu asura bahana. The balas mum, it's forbidden to have benefit from it because it retains some kind of sanctity, and you slaughtered it while it was still holding on to that sanctity, so it's completely unfit for use. Now I should point out that the line we just read is the way the Rambam is printed in most Rambams. But if you look in the Talmud, that follows the view of Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, who is an individual. The majority of the sages understand the law in the complete opposite way. And I'll explain. They also agree that after you redeem a blemished animal, some sanctity still remains to it. But the way they understand it is that when you slaughter it, that's when you completely get rid of its sanctity. And because of that, follow this, a little bit confusing. Because of that, in this scenario where you have one blemished and one unblemished, you must slaughter the blemished animal which you redeemed before offering the unblemished animal. Because if you don't, and you end up offering the unblemished animal first, since the blemished animal, even though it's been redeemed, is still carrying some sanctity of a sin offering, we're going to have to look at it as though it's a sin offering whose owner used a different sin offering to atone for his sin, in which case the first sin offering has to be left to die. So if you're going to offer the unblemished animal first, while the blemished animal is still alive, it's going to have to left to die. On the other hand, if you slaughter the blemished animal, excuse the noise in the background, they're just fixing the doors. If you slaughter the blemished animal before offering the unblemished animal, that's when you'll be able to completely derive benefit from it. It will be allowed to be used because at this point you will have taken it out completely to chulin before the actual intended sin offering is going to be offered. That's how the sages understand it. And the Kesef Mishnah actually says that the Rambam should be amended to reflect the view of the sages. And he reads the line, let's read it inside. He reads the line as follows. He says, Nishchato balas mum, koidem she'izarek dama tmima. If the blemished animal was slaughtered before the offering of the unblemished animal, even if it was just slaughtered before the sprinkling of the blood of the unblemished animal. In other words, the point is you did the slaughtering at some point before the sacrificial service was completed for the unblemished animal, muteres bahana. that's when it's permitted to derive benefit from the slaughtered blemished animal because you've completely deconsecrated it before doing the service on the unblemished animal. But if you only got around to slaughtering the blemished animal after completing the offering service of the unblemished animal, after the sprinkling of the blood, so what do you have now? You've brought a sin offering, the owner has atoned for himself with a sin offering while another animal which was somewhat sanctified, with chata sanctity, was around. And therefore, harezu asura bahana. The slaughtered, blemished animal is actually now forbidden to have benefit from it. It's like a chata that's left to die. You cannot do anything with it. Just an interesting note from the Kesef Mishnah. Hayushtein bali mumin. Going now back to the same case. You put aside a chatas, you lost it. You put aside a second one, you found the first one, you have two in front of you, and now they're both actually blemished. Yimachru shtei, and you must sell them both, v'yavi midmehem chatas, from the combined proceeds. Bring a sin offering, v'hashar yipel indava, and the rest will go towards voluntary burnt offerings. Halacha dalid, hifrish chatasei v'avda. Consider this scenario with three animals. You put aside a chatas, it got lost. V'hifrish acheres tachtea v'avda, you put aside a second one, instead of it also got lost. V'hifrish acheres, you put aside a third one now. V'nimtzu ha'ivdais, and you found the two that got lost. V'harei shloshtan oimdais. And now you have three animals standing. Excuse the drilling in the back again, I'm sorry. We're installing new bulletproof doors in Chabad, and they're doing some repair work on the doors. They were installed a little bit incorrectly, it seems. So that's the drilling. Just forgive the noise. So we have now three potential sin offerings. And the question is, what do you do? So the guiding principle is going to be, any animal that's directly linked to the animal that ends up being offered needs to die. Any animal that's 2 steps away from the offered animal is left to graze. The Lipskier, says the Rambam, if the owner ended up atoning for himself with the original first animal, shnia mesa, the second one dies, because that's the one that has to be treated like the one at which the owner used another sin offering. Ushlish istoraya, the third one, it isn't even in the equation, it's 2 steps away, it's left to graze. Niskaper, bashlish, if you use the third one, shnia mesa, second one dies, that's the one closest to it. V'rishaynaraya, and the first one goes to graze. Niskaper b'imtsois, if you use the middle one, shteyem mesa, since the two are removed only 1 step from the actual offered animal, they both have to die. Halacha hey hamafrish techatois lachrayas. A person puts aside initially 2 sin offerings for security. That means he didn't want to get into a problem, he's going to get lost. I'll put aside 2 just in case. Niskaper be'ezes sheyirtza, you can use whichever one you want. The hashniya tirat sheyipol b'mum, the second one, because it has some kind of holiness, needs to be left to graze till it develops a blemish. V'yipol damel indava, and its money goes to voluntary burnt offerings. Halacha vav hifrish chatas meuberes v'yolda. If you set aside an animal as a sin offering and it was pregnant and it gave birth, since the fetus was extant at the time that you consecrated it, now that it's born, the mother and the baby are considered to be like 2 sin offerings which you put aside for security. You can bring whichever one you want. The vlad chatas, which we spoke about before, in the beginning of the chapter, the baby, which is left to die, is only a case where the sin offering was consecrated. It became pregnant in the course of consecration and then gave birth. But if it was consecrated while pregnant, the fact that it gave birth doesn't make it left to die. It's like 2 separate chatas. Halacha zayin hamafrish chatasei va'avra shnasa. A person sets aside a chatas and it just passes its time frame. You have to bring a chatas in its first year of life. The year passes, what do you do now? Tirat sheyipol b'mum, you let it graze. This is one of the chatois, not that die, but that are left to graze. They go to graze until it gets a mum, v'timacher, you sell it, v'yavi b'dameh acheres, and bring another one with the money. V'cheinim hifrish chatasei v'nafal b'mum. Same thing if you put aside a carbon chatas, then I got a blemish. Yavi b'dameh acheres, convert it, bring its money, and use its money for another sin offering. Halacha ches, kol chatas she'avda, v'nimtzes koidem kapara. Any sin offering which was lost, but was found before the atonement was done, afal pisha nimtzes balas mum. Even though when it's found it has a blemish or it's past its time frame, it never dies. It grazes till it develops a blemish, and the money goes towards a burnt offering. If it was found after atonement, even if it was found with a blemish or past its time frame, as long as it was lost at the time that the atonement happened, it dies. Basically a restatement of the previous laws, just in a context of a rule. It doesn't matter what its state is. If it was found before atonement, graze. After atonement, dies. Halacha tes, but it has to be lost. If it was stolen by theft or by robbery during atonement time, and then it came back, it doesn't die, it only grazes. Because the halacha l'Moshe Misinai about the 4 chatasas that die, the 4th one was termed lost. That's all we heard. We didn't hear stolen or robbed. Even within lost, says the Rambam, if the time that it was lost was by night, when you can't bring sacrifices anyways, even if it was lost throughout the atonement time, it doesn't die, it only grazes. Halacha Yud, lost means completely lost. If it was only lost to the owner but not to the shepherd. Or it was lost to the shepherd but not to the owner. Doesn't die, it only grazes because it wasn't fully lost. In all these cases where we have the animals graze, grazing means again the same principle. They graze till they get a blemish, and the money goes to burnt offerings. If it was lost to the owner and to the shepherd, but there's somebody in the world who knows where it is, it's a doubt, therefore it must be left to die. At least you and the shepherd know you both didn't know where it was. Now that you found it, you must kill it. If the animal was discovered to be hiding behind the door or under the stairs, I made this with AI. I asked AI to give me a sheep hiding behind the door. That's what we got. That's lost. While the atonement was being done with the other animal, nobody knew where this animal was. If the animal was in the field or in a meadow, it's an open space, somebody might have seen it. It's only a doubt whether it's lost. Maybe there was somebody who was seeing it at the time of atonement in the temple with the other sin offering. Therefore, it has to always be lost, has to be left to die, only out of doubt. Halacha Yudalit, talking about one of the conditions for a chatayis amesois, the owner has to be alive. If somebody sends a sin offering from overseas, we offer it on his behalf, assuming that he is alive. We don't have to worry that maybe he's dead and the sin offering has to be left to die. But when is that? Only with bird sin offerings, or it's an animal sin offering brought on behalf of a woman, which doesn't do smicha, she doesn't do the leaning. But if it's a man's animal sin offering, we will not offer it unless he's here because he has to do smicha. So for another reason, it's not going to happen. Now in my Rambam I have the word aval, but I believe in the accurate Rambam there's no aval, right? It just goes to the next case, osham vadai. Even though it's the middle of halacha, we're kind of transitioning to the next subject. We're done with chatas, done with sin offering, moving to guilt offering. Osham vadai. We have a definite guilt offering. In guilt offerings, there are 2 types of guilt offerings. There's the osham vadai, a guilt offering which you bring for a definite sin, and then there's asham tolui, a guilt offering which you bring out of doubt. If you're not sure if you did a sin which would require you to bring a chatas, a sin offering, then Torah says you have to bring a doubtful guilt offering. So first we'll talk about the definite guilt offering. Definite guilt offering is for 5 specific scenarios where you bring a definite asham. So you bring an asham, you set it aside, shemesu ba'alav v'shekipru ba'alav, and one of these cases applies to it. The owner dies, or the owner used another one to atonement. We don't have an asham that dies. It grazes till it gets a mum, sold, and the money goes to voluntary burnt offerings. Because the rule is, any scenario where a chatas would die, when the equivalent happens to a guilt offering, it has to be left to graze till it gets a blemish, and the money goes to donations, to voluntary burnt offerings. Halacha tezvav kol asham shanitak liriyah, any guilt offering that was consigned to grazing, if you ended up offering it as a burnt offering, kosher, it's kosher, because a burnt offering is a male, asham was also a male, and so you could just bring it as a different offering. Anyways, it's not a full asham. Why only after the fact? What about initially? Just bring it as a burnt offering. So like we had in the beginning of the chapter, we decree in the case of after atonement, because of the case of before atonement. If you find the asham before using the second one to atone for yourself, you couldn't just bring it as a burnt offering, you have to transfer it. So even if you find it after the atonement, you must transfer it. After the fact, if your brother isn't ill, it's okay. Halacha tazayin amafrish nekeva la'ashamay. A person puts aside a female animal for his guilt offering. Not allowed. Has to be a male. Tirdat shripa b'mum. Let it graze till the blemish develops. V'timacher v'yavibidamel asham. Sell it and bring with its money an actual guilt offering. Im hikriv ashamay. If he had already offered his guilt offering with another animal, yipol damel lindava, then the money you get from the sold female animal should go as a donation to voluntary burnt offerings. V'chein vlada, also if it has a baby. Halacha yud zayin hifrish nekeva lo'ilasei. A person puts aside a female for his burnt offering, which is not allowed, has to be a male. V'yolda zachar, but it gives birth to a male. Yirad she'yipol b'mum, it's still not a full burnt offering, it has to graze till it gets a blemish. V'yavi b'dam avayla, and you sell it, get, with the money you bring a burnt offering. Halacha yudches aval hedyoid shehifrish zachar lechatos. But if a regular person would put aside a male for a sin offering, an individual sin offering always has to be a female. He puts aside a male. V'nasi shehifrish seida lechatos. Or if a king puts aside a female goat for a sin offering. Funny enough, a king has to bring a male sin offering. He puts aside a female. The kohen mashiach shehifrish pada lechatos, or the high priest who puts aside a cow, not a bull, for his sin offering. For like tushas damim, they have no sanctity at all, not bodily nor monetary. They could even be sold without a blemish. The gender mistake only goes with guilt offerings and burnt offerings, not with sin offerings. What about if you brought a doubtful guilt offering? Again, the guilt offering is where you're not sure if you did an avera, which would require you to bring a chatas. You have to bring in the meantime an asham tali. So you brought an asham tali, and then you find out, you know what, you actually didn't sin. Or you actually did sin, you have to bring a carbon chatas now. If you found out before the asham tali was slaughtered, leave this animal to graze till it gets a blemish and have its money go to voluntary burnt offerings. Why? You didn't sin. Or you did sin. The point is you don't need the sacrifice at all. Why does it retain any sanctity? It's only out of doubt. It says that we have a halacha. A Jewish person's heart worries about his sins. Once he put it aside even for a doubt, he was completely dedicating it to the holiness. And so even if it's discovered that it was not needed in the first place, he still gives it some sanctity and therefore has to be left to graze till it gets a mum. If you put it aside, even with witnesses, and the witnesses became disqualified, so too the money here should go towards voluntary burnt offerings. If you only found out that he no longer needed this guilt offering after the slaughtering, if the blood should be spilled, the meat should be burnt, Pesulei Hamukdashin, like any disqualified sacrifice. If you found out after the full sacrificial procedure was done, even the blood was sprinkled, well, that's the whole point of an asham tali. It's brought just in case. Now you resolve the doubt, but it's already been sacrificed. Let the kohen eat the meat like any asham. The definite guilt offering doesn't work that way. If before it was slaughtered, you discover you didn't even sin, it just goes out and grazes in the flock like any chulin. It's totally mundane. It has no holiness at all. If it was already slaughtered and you cover, you just bury it. Even if the blood was sprinkled, the meat goes out to be burnt like any disqualified sacrifice. Because you've never been obligated to bring the sacrifice at all. Funny case. A person is obligated to bring a sacrifice only out of doubt. The whole sacrifice is only out of doubt. He puts aside two for security. He can use one. Second one, leave to graze till it gets a blemish. And the money goes to voluntary burnt offerings. If that's true about a doubtful asham, then for sure about a definite asham, you put aside two definite ashams for security, and you use one. The other one is to be left to graze. Chav Beis, special rule by an asham. All guilt offerings in the Torah come in their second year. They're a ram. It says ayil. Ayil is the second year. And they have to be brought for at least kesef shkalim, 2 silver coins worth. Chutz me'asham mitzayra v'asham nazir, except for the guilt offering offered by a person who has tzaras, lesions, and a Nazirite, shehem b'nei shana ve'en lidmeim kitzva. They have to be brought only in their first year, and they don't have a price, set price. Asham tali, the doubtful guilt offering, ba minak tanim ay minak dailim. It can be whether small or old, first or second year. But it does have the second rule that does apply, has to be at least 2 silver coins. If a person is obligated to bring a guilt offering, but rams are so cheap, he can't find the ram for 2 silver coins. He has no way to fix this. He must wait till the price goes up, and he can bring an ashram for 2 silver coins. Torah was particular about its money. The Nasl Kitzba gave it a price. Kesef shkalim. You can't buy kesef shkalim. You gotta wait. If a person set aside a ram as a guilt offering, at the time, it was only worth 1 coin, which wouldn't be appropriate. But by the time you actually brought it, it was worth 2. Kosher, that's kosher. Because something that was something rejected at the outset is not considered to be rejected. It never becomes fit till it's worth 2 coins. Even if it went up in price on its own, it would seem then that you shouldn't use it, right? Because after you consecrated it, it's in the property of a temple treasury. Now that it goes up, the profit belongs to temple treasury. If you're going to use it now, you're using temple's profits. That's okay. A person can atone for himself with profit incurred by temple treasury. If it went down in price. When you put it aside, it was good, it was 2 coins. Then it went up, then it went down. By the time of atonement, it's only worth 1 selah. How is it possible? It's disqualified. If it goes back to up in price to 2, it goes back to being kosher. An animal that's alive can never be rejected. As we explained, what's this case similar to? Like a mum that came and passed. It was a fleeting wound. So it was a fleeting reduction in market price. A person puts aside 2 coins to buy an asham. With the 2 coins, he manages to buy 2 rams. If inherently one of them was worth 2 coins, and just because it was like a buy one get one free package or whatever it is, he can bring it as his asham, while the second one grazes till it gets a blemish, and the money goes to burnt offerings. Why? Because the fact that you got a deal for 2 coins for 2 was your, again, buy one get one free, or like airplane tickets. You buy just the one way, it'll cost you more sometimes even double than if you bought a round trip for one of the legs. Because when you buy a package, people will charge you cheaper, but inherently the one-way ticket is worth that amount. Inherently the 1 ram is worth 2, therefore it's good. If you were obligated to bring a guilt offering that was 1-year-old, Nazir or Mitzera, and you bought a 2-year-old, 2nd year, or you're obligated to bring a 2nd year, you bought a 1st year, or you brought it while lacking time, meaning the time to bring the sacrifice didn't arrive yet. Puzzle, it's disqualified, or to ubar tzurasai, let it pass its required time frame of eating, and go be burnt. Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kala pasul bechatas pasul ba'asham. Anytime a sin offering is disqualified, so is a guilt offering. Chutz mina asham sheshchate shalei l'shmai, except for a guilt offering that was slaughtered with the wrong intent. Shu kosher k'meshi yisbar, which is kosher as will be explained in later chapters. Chavzayin oilas nazir oilas yoldes oilas mitzayra. The burnt offering that belongs to a Nazirite or to a birthing woman or to a person with saras lesions, they all bring multiple sacrifices. One of them is a burnt offering. If they slaughter them after the year passed, it's supposed to be in their 1st year. They were 12 months and 1 day old. Or they brought it before the appropriate time on the owner's account. It was the wrong day, it was an early day. Kshedim, they're still kosher, to unin nisachin, they actually require libations. Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kol she'ene paisel ba'ilas nadava, ene paisel ba'ilas chayva. A circumstance which does not disqualify in a voluntary burnt offering also cannot disqualify an obligatory burnt offering. Bein also labailin, bein shalei also lehem, regardless of whether or not it works for the owner, the sacrifice itself is a kosher sacrifice.